Welcome to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas, and I'm Ken Hicks. We have been dealing this class and the class before it, and we'll be dealing with have two more presentations on fascism. The issues we're going to deal with today, we're going to conclude our discussion of fascism in Italy. We're going to talk a little bit about fascism generically in theory and in practice. Look a little bit at a couple of writings by Italian fascists. And then we're going to begin our discussion of fascism in Germany. And I often get asked the question in my classes when I teach this particular section on fascism, how did these people come to power? And, you know, it's not like there are a bunch of Simon Bar Sinister folks going, I'm going to kill millions of people. You know, it really isn't that, they don't start off that way. They always start off articulating a kind of grievance that connects them with a large number of people. It's not often a majority of the people in Italy or Germany or anywhere else, or Spain or Argentina or anywhere else where you've really seen, or South Africa or India. You're typically not talking about an overwhelming majority of the physical people in a country, but you are talking about a large enough group of people that they can magnify their influence and their voice. And what you find in both Germany and Italy is that fascists took over, basically saying, we're going to clean things up. We're going to make the trains run on time. We're going to get rid of the corruption. All you have to do is give us all the power. And what typically has happened is that those countries where fascism has taken root, the dictatorship didn't necessarily result in the most effective and efficient government. And what often happened was you saw exercises, a series of exercises in distracting people. Look at the bad person. We need to attack them. We deserve breathing space. We must, conquer or we will be conquered. And so that's really kind of the lesson that you find with most variants of fascism, that they begin, again, oftentimes as people, they feel, they look at Benito Mussolini with his head jaw jutted out and standing arms akimbo, and you think he's a bit of a blusterer, a bit of a braggart. The same with Hitler. He was viewed to some extent by domestic opponents as not serious, as a bit demented. But nevertheless, they have a kind of charisma that attracts certain people. And in the post World War II period, you had a lot of Americans say, well, that couldn't happen here, couldn't happen with us. Well, a bunch of social science experiments basically demonstrated, that yeah, it could possibly happen here. There are Americans who are amenable to those kinds of arguments. And so let's get back into fascism in Italy. Fascism, Italy was the first country where fascism really took root. They helped Spain in the Spanish Civil War and enabled Francisco Franco to to install a fascist dictatorship in 1932. Germany basically joined the fascist club. But the problem, for Italian fascism was that its territorial aspirations always exceeded its capacity. It always, exceeded its ability to project power. And so, Italian fascism's, grandiose, aspirations really contributed directly to the downfall of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini began engaging. Italy was one of the first countries that began, basically saying, we deserve more land, we're going to take it. Italy added Ethiopia to its African colonial possessions. They actually got a couple of Germany's former African possessions as well. But Mussolini's, had much broader ambitions. He wanted to resurrect the Roman Empire and go beyond it, really. Mussolini would basically say, look at the birth rates in England and France. They're declining. Their population is in decline. They're weak. They're ripe for the picking. They have, they're war weary after World War I. They're afraid of war. And so Mussolini made a very fateful decision to join into an alliance with Nazi Germany. And, by 1936, by 36, Hitler had been in power for about 3 years and had begun really aggressively militarizing. And Italy and Germany kind of joined together in facilitating the nationalist takeover in Spain. The Spanish Civil War was really a conflict between two groups, two broad coalitions, the nationalists and the Republicans. On the nationalist side were the Falange Party, which was a hyper-nationalist party, monarchists, and other right-wing folks. And they really kind of dominated what we might call a pseudo-fascist regime. We'll talk more about Spain in our third presentation. From 1939 until Francisco Franco's death in 1975. So the nationalists were comprised of monarchists, conservatives, the Falange Party, led by Generalissimo Francisco Franco, and other kinds of traditional, largely pro-Catholic conservatives. The Republicans were largely consisted of socialists, anarchists, communists, and a variety of separatist movements. If you don't know that much about Spanish politics, there are two major ethnic groups in Spain that have always wanted to basically secede from the Castilian Union of Spain. The Basques in kind of the northwest, and then the Catalonians in the eastern part of Spain. And so those were the folks that were fighting against the nationalists. And both Germany and Italy intervened in really material ways in the Spanish Civil War, and they were very kind of instrumental in securing the nationalist victory, which was viewed at the time as a harbinger of war, of a more generalized war in Europe. And you had several very famous folks that really fought, for the most part, on the Republican side. George Orwell, the famed British author of 1984, An Animal Farm, fought on the Republican side of the war. And the American author Ernest Hemingway covered the war for North American newspapers, and I believe might have driven an ambulance for a period of time. A number of American emigres in Europe came to Spain and fought on the Republican side. And so that really was sort of a warning for Europe generally, that this kind of right-wing hyper-nationalism was really on the march. And keep in mind, in 1936, you heard Italian fascists, and Germans talking about fascism, but there really wasn't this broad sense that Europeans generally understood what fascism really meant. And so ultimately, Italy, joins with Germany in the Axis alliance with Germany, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Japan, which was also a deeply authoritarian, regime. The problem for Italy was they were simply unprepared, and frankly, Germany was largely unprepared as well. But Germany had an enormous industrial capacity. And really was the largest economy, in Europe, and was able to militarize quite rapidly, even though in the opening days of the war they were not really fully prepared. But Germany's opening moves, kind of joining with Russia to partition Poland, really kind of set the stage for the war, and pulled Italy along with Germany into, what became the generalized conflict that would be World War II. Italy attempted to help out Germany. The argument would be, early in days of World War II, that Italy would take over Greece, and they would take over Libya and Egypt and deny Great Britain, access to the Suez Canal. The problem was Italy's military couldn't do any of that stuff, and they were defeated rather decisively. Hitler increasingly found himself having to, send, Wehrmacht and elements into Eastern Europe, into the Balkans, into Africa, where he sent one of his best generals to try and counter the British and ultimately the Americans there. Of course, in 1941, America's entrance into the war really kind of spelled the doom of the Axis powers. Mussolini's ineffectiveness. Increasingly he was losing control of the country. In particular, as British and American forces successively invaded Sicily and then ultimately Italy. Again, Germany was compelled to intervene, and it was German forces that were largely making Allied forces march up the Italian peninsula very difficult. And Mussolini was ultimately overthrown in 1943. He was actually held captive for a period of time. King Victor Emmanuel III stripped Mussolini of his dictatorial powers. They jailed him for a period of time. And Germany ultimately launched a very daring rescue mission. A guy named Otto Skorzeny was the kind of the Nazi paratrooper that led the whole thing. They rescued Mussolini and kept him in power in northern Italy in what became known as the Salo Republic, which lasted for about 2 years. But ultimately, Mussolini recognized by 45 that he was done. He actually described to a friend, "I'm a corpse. I'm a dead man walking. I go through the motions." And by April of 1945, Allied troops had finally broken down German defenses and were advancing in northern Italy, threatening Mussolini's puppet regime, where he had lived since September of 43. Sensing defeat, Mussolini and his mistress sought to, and a retinue of followers sought to flee into Switzerland, where he planned to fly to Spain. But on April 27th, Mussolini's caravan was stopped in a village by communist partisans. The following day, Mussolini and everyone in his 15-person caravan were summarily shot by communist forces, and their corpses were hung upside down from the roof of a service station. This was widely shown, it was widely known in Europe what happened to Mussolini. I don't include a picture of this because I think it's gratuitous, but it had a profound effect on Hitler himself. And we're going to talk about Hitler in a few minutes, who effectively thought, well, that ain't happening to me. I am not going to be brought out and displayed. And that had a profound impact on how Hitler planned on dealing with his end. I want to talk for a minute and just, again, talk a little bit about what, the ideas behind fascism, because the writings of the fascists themselves are really kind of obscure and hard to understand, because they know what they're doing. They know that in a fundamental sense, they're selling a really unpopular product. Okay, and so when you read Mussolini, when you read this, this other fascist, Italian fascist, and ultimately when you read, Hitler, you're reading people who largely know what they're, that what they're doing is inhuman in a way. So let's talk a little bit about Benito Mussolini, the doctrine of fascism. And so for Mussolini, he would write, and remember, this was a guy who was a newspaper editor for a long time for socialist newspapers. He argued that fascism was both a practice and a thought. There is no concept of the state which is not fundamentally a concept of life. Now, ask yourself, what does that actually mean? He is effectively binding up human life within the practice of the state. Mussolini would declare the man of fascism is an individual who is nation and fatherland. And so just as fascists would often say the individual shorn of history, shorn of language, shorn of religion is a mere abstraction, and in fact they are only rendered corporeal as Italian, as German or whatever. Fascism for Mussolini was a spiritualized conception formed in reaction against the flabby materialistic positivism of the 19th century. Remember, positivism is just this idea that we can know the world through science, right? And so fascism for Mussolini was an ethical concept of life. It is serious, austere, religious, even as, again, fascists and especially the Nazis were basically advancing an atheistic concept. The fascist disdains the comfortable life. There is again this sense of stoicism in fascism that they are trying to instill in people, right? And why are they trying to instill a sense of stoicism? What is stoicism? It is a sense in which the world is a matter of indifference to me. Because these folks want to condition individual human beings to be mere instruments of state design. And who would be the actual operator of the state? It would be Il Duce, it would be the leader. So fascism is a religious conception that sees individuals as subordinate to a higher law and an objective will. Whatever that means. Again, there's a lot in fascism that is rendered into a kind of opaque, what I might call idealism. The idea that human beings exist solely within thought, and that our ability to apprehend the material world is always mediated through language. So fascism is a historical conception. Outside history, man is nothing. Mussolini would declare. On these grounds, fascism rejects all individualistic abstractions. Fascists reject individualism in preference to the state. And it is for the individual insofar as he coincides with the state. In other words, as long as you are an individual contributing to the state, you may be as eccentric as you choose to be. For the fascist, everything is in the state and nothing human or spiritual exists, much less has value outside the state. This reflects, the syllogism of fascism, which I'll talk about in a minute. Fascism rejects both individuals in the form of liberalism and classes in the form of socialism. So fascism is opposed to socialism, which confines the movement of history within class struggle. Fascism is likewise opposed to democracy, which equates the nation to the mere majority. They talk about nose counting as if that was some sort of ridiculous exercise. The nation is the state. The state creates the nation by giving to the people a will. And again, for Mussolini, the fascist state is the highest and most powerful form of personality. So what is the political and social doctrine of fascism? It rejects the possibility of perpetual peace. Hitler would say much the same thing. War alone brings up to the highest tension all human energies and puts the stamp of nobility upon the peoples who have the courage. The proud motto of the squadrista, the black shirt, "Me ne frego," which is, "I don't give a damn." Written on the bandages of a wound is an act of philosophy which is not only stoical, it is the epitome of a doctrine that is not only political, it is education for combat. This is again, Mussolini basically saying, we want our soldiers to be indifferent to their own wounds. We don't, self-preservation only matters to the extent that my self-preservation, advances the cause of the nation. And if my death advances the cause of the nation, it is to be preferred to captivity. So fascism is unalterably opposed to democracy. Democracy is a regime without a king, but with very many kings. Fascism rejects the absurd conventional lie of political egalitarianism. Again, it is innate to fascism that some people are simply better than others. However, repudiation of democracy, liberalism, and socialism does not mean that fascism is a mere reactionary stance. And so, Mussolini would declare, the fascist doctrine has not chosen de Maistre as its prophet. Remember our discussion of conservatism and Joseph de Maistre. And so fascism is clearly saying, we recall the glories of Rome and all these other, great historical periods where our special people were great. But we don't want to go back in time. We want to take that martial glory and push it forward. It's important to remember that the idea of totalitarianism really emerges in Italy. And so a party that governs in a totalitarian way is a new fact in history, picking up from the ruins of liberal and socialist democracy and ushering in a century of the right. And again, he's basically saying we have to do dramatic things to remake society in such a way that people will be brought back to the proper understanding of what it means to be a human within a fascist state. If you look at the slide here, this is a picture of a bunch of little kids, holding guns, with adults in between them. And again, the suggestion is we're taking over all aspects of life. We're taking over the social, the socializing aspects of what it means to be an Italian. It's no longer a matter for individual Italian families to determine what it means to be an Italian. It's the Italian state that will tell people, who they will be. It's a very distinctive notion of what it means to be an Italian. And if you know any Italians, you understand why this ultimately failed. The keystone of the fascist doctrine, and a lot of this is repetitive if you think about it. The keystone for fascism is the state is absolute. For fascism, the state is an absolute before which individuals and groups are relative. It is the state alone that can solve the dramatic contradictions of capitalism. The fascist state includes the economy to harness a people's productive capacities. If you look at this slide, this is basically how fascists conceive the relationship between the government and their economy. And if you understand what happens within this kind of command economy, you understand why Italy wasn't able to militarize. They simply lacked that capacity. And it's not to say that Germany has no industrial capacity, particularly in the north. They had their own kind of industrial revolution. So briefly, fascism in theory and practice. What is Italian fascism as an ideology? It is, again, the rejection of atomism and individualism, subscribing instead to an organic conception of society, the centrality of the state, the need for citizens' collective commitment to the state, led by Il Duce, the leader. The syllogism of Italian fascism was everything or all inside the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Fascist view of freedom. Freedom for the fascist has nothing to do with personal liberty. Freedom is reflected in the integrated, organic whole that unites individuals and classes behind the iron shield of the all-power state under the leadership of an iron-fisted Duce. Freedom is service to the state. The people left to themselves, according to fascists, are merely a herd, incapable of direction except by an elite which is itself directed by an all-powerful and presumably all-knowing leader. So when you look at the fascist view of freedom, the agent is the nation state. It's not any kind of individual. The obstacle is individualism, independent groups, class divisions. The goal is state, the state and its glory, the state and its advances, the state and its conquests. An important element of all this is this notion of corporativism, which is it's usually spoken of as a contraction, corporatism, which really simply reflects that government plays a role within the economy, oftentimes in managing the conflicts that emerge between management and labor. within a state. There are many corporatist states today. In Northern Europe, for example, all the Scandinavian countries, Germany, exercise something that we might describe as corporatism. One of the things that was shocking to German corporations when they started setting up plants in the South is they would look around and go, where are the labor unions? Because they were used to working with labor unions. And in the South, labor unions have effectively been suppressed. Okay? And so corporatism is really a concept originating within the Catholic Church, beginning in the late 19th century. Pope Leo XIII formed a commission of theologians and social reformers to study the relationship between owners, workers, and governments because of the poverty that industrialization was producing in Catholic countries. So the commission concluded that corporatism constituted a system of social organization that has at its base the grouping of men according to the community of their natural interests and social functions. And as true and proper organs of the state, they direct and coordinate labor and capital in matters of common interest. In other words, the state plays a role in mediating relations between the owners of capital and the labor that do the work. Okay? So it was instituted in fascist Italy in 1922. Italian corporatism involved, again, a collaborative relationship between workers, owners, and government, run through through a very powerful ministry of corporations. So it is a significant feature of the totalitarianism in Italian fascist ideology. And it reflected, again, this notion, everything inside the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. There will be no strikes, there will be no lockouts, because that is harmful to the state. And so another brief interlude, we're going to talk about this guy, Alfredo Rocco. He wrote, this was a guy who was a legal scholar in Italy. He was the minister of justice about the time he wrote this essay called The Political Theory of Fascism. In the early years, you had people like Rocco, who basically took up the task of instantiating fascism into the law. And this is another important aspect of fascism, that they recognize that the law has to be rewritten and overwritten to subsume individual rights to the state. Rocco specialized in commercial law. He helped develop and implement corporatism in Italy. He was a leading figure in the far-right Italian National Association, which merged with Italian fascism in the 1920s. And ultimately he served as Minister of Justice under Mussolini and was, by all accounts, very close to Mussolini up to his death in 1935. So the political theory of fascism. Again, fascism as action and sentiment. I'm not sure, why fascists feel the need to offer us this kind of word salad. Again, a quotation, only because it is feeling and sentiment, only because it is the unconscious reawakening of our profound racial instinct, has it the force to stir the soul of a people. There is this sense in which they are attempting to say, this is stuff that is about your beating heart, and you have to feel it, deeply within your soul. Rocco argues that fascism is a distinctly Italian theory of politics. Another quotation, the originality of fascism is due in great part to the autonomy of its theoretical principles. Again, what does he mean by that? Common origins and common backgrounds. Modern political thought has been trapped by the doctrines grounded in the Atlantic tradition and of the Protestant Reformation. Again, this is a distinctly, at this point, fascism is a distinctly Catholic phenomenon, okay? It is happening in places like Italy and Spain. It doesn't happen until the 30s, in Germany. The common basis of all these doctrines is a social and state concept, which I shall call mechanical or atomistic. And again, this is a rejection of the Enlightenment. This is a rejection of both. And what they're basically saying, they're collapsing both liberalism and socialism, which is a very common move, a very common rhetorical move. It's sort of saying there's not a dime's worth of difference between a liberal and a socialist. And this is a very common move among fascism of this period. Rocco contends that an atomistic view is necessarily anti-historical, which ignores history and the spiritual life of human societies. So fascists conceive of liberalism, democracy, and socialism as the offspring of the same theory of government, which is again the welfare of individual members of society. And Rocco would go further and say liberalism arose and began to thrive in the period of small industry. Socialism grew with the rise of industrialism and of worldwide capitalism. The dissension, therefore, between these 2 points of views, or the antithesis, if we wish to call it, is limited to the economic field. Socialism is at odds with liberalism only on the question of the organization of production and the division of wealth. Ultimately, Rocco would conclude that even Russian Bolshevism is effectively contingent. The end game is the same, which is, this Enlightenment point at which people would have individual freedom. And again, the fascists are saying we have nothing to do with that. So fascism is the antithesis of both liberalism and socialism. Now, at this point in his writing, Rocco admits fascism is indifferent to method. We'll use liberal means. We'll occasionally use socialist means. They talk about the idea of seizing the state, and people could say that's the dictatorship of the proletariat, except it's not. It's the state seizing the state, and it's the state seizing the economy. Fascism's apparently incoherence is explained by its rejection of theories of natural law in favor of an organic theory of the state. So Rocco is not referencing an otherwise conservative interpretation of an organic state, a la Edmund Burke from one of our earlier presentations. Instead, he's arguing that the fascist organic view gives to society a continuous life over and beyond the existence of mere individuals. And there again, he's even damning conservatives as saying, you're not conservative enough because you still believe in individual freedom in some way. Rocco declares something similar to John F. Kennedy's remark in his inaugural address, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This is John F. Kennedy pushed to, a crazy extreme. Again, for fascism, society is the end, individuals the means, and its whole life consists in using individuals as instruments for its social ends. This is the guy articulating a political theory of fascism. And so liberty, government, and social justice, okay, we have those, but we don't have a Bill of Rights. We don't have any notion of limited government. Freedom, therefore, is due to the citizens and classes on the condition that they exercise it in the interests of society as a whole and within the limits set by social exigencies, liberty being, like other individual rights, a concession of the state. In other words, we'll allow you to be individuals provided that you demonstrate what you're doing is good for the people running the state. We reserve the right to suppress anything that we think is not in the interests of the people running the state. Regarding democracy, Rocco writes that while democracy lodges sovereignty in the people, fascism discovers sovereignty to be inherent in society when it is juridically organized as a state. So no, there is no popular sovereignty of the fascist state. They do not concede that the legitimacy of the state arises from the consent of the governed. Unsurprisingly, a lot of what the fascists are writing about is an absolute rejection of socialism. So acknowledging the serious question raised by the socialist project, which is, again, the relations between capital and labor, Rocco would say that the chief defect of the socialist method is, again, all it talks about is class warfare, right? The socialist remedy to class exploitation is more class warfare. Fascism rejects that remedy, calling instead to resolve the capital-labor conflict in the form of state justice. The state will remediate conflicts between capital and labor. And so, in effect, they are appropriating what would otherwise, syndicalism really refers to the kind of socialism, anarchist socialism of a Charles Fourier or a Pierre Proudhon. They're basically saying, we will syndicalize the country, but it will be the state mediating those kinds of conflicts. That is the essence of corporatism, really, okay? So ask yourself the question, was Italy truly a totalitarian fascist state? For a variety of reasons, the answer has to be no. Corporatism facilitated corruption in ways that undermined economic efficiency and in ways that undermined the ability of the Italian state to control the day-to-day activities of Italians. Key cultural features. Remember what I said about Italy, right? It's a very long peninsula with a huge mountain range running through it, and these these river valleys that separated, Italian communities from one another. That kind of cultural pluralism made it very difficult for Italian fascists to get everybody on the same page, and there were always these pockets of resistance to Italian fascism. Likewise, an important aspect of totalitarianism is there is no rival institution to the fascist state, or for that matter, to the communist state, if you're thinking about left-wing totalitarianism. Italian fascists made significant concessions to the Catholic Church, the Italian monarchy, and to a number of traditional Italian elites. A number of very wealthy industrialists basically came out of fascism scot-free. So vast areas of Italy remained highly resistant to fascist control. So the argument would have to be, or you would have to make the argument, that there's a lot of evidence that Italy was never a totalitarian state, even as they originated the idea. It was the Russians and the Germans that were far more effective at using totalitarianism to basically control minute aspects of the states. And so let's move on and begin our discussion of fascism in Germany. A far more virulent strain of fascism in the form of Nazism. So, like Italy, the rise and fall of German fascism is largely reflected in the experiences of one person. Like Italy, Germans' experience with fascism is innately linked to the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. Hitler was actually an Austrian. He was born near the Austria-German border. As a young man, he aspired to be an artist. He went to Vienna and spent some time there trying to get people to buy his paintings and burnish his reputation as an artist. If you've seen any of his artistic work, he was at best kind of a workmanlike artist. So unsurprisingly, he did not really catch fire in Vienna. He decided as World War I approached that he would ultimately serve in the German Wehrmacht. He was 25 in 1914 when he first saw service in World War I. Hitler requested permission to serve in the Bavarian army units rather than serve in the Austrian army. Hitler was breveted multiple times. Over the course of the war, he was widely viewed as very brave within combat. He displayed initiative. He received battlefield promotions. He was also wounded twice over the course of the war. Was actually coalescing when the war came to an end. Battlefield comrades recall Hitler as an aloof and relatively apolitical person. But letters written, in the latter months of the war began to include, complaints about foreign influence and certain kinds of anti-Semitic expressions. Germany's surrender at the end of the war. I mentioned sort of the end of World War I and the Spartacist uprising in our discussion of socialism. That really facilitated the perception among Germans of a stab in the back. When the armistice was announced and the Kaiser abdicated, Germany still was on the other side, or they were still occupying French territory. In many parts of the Western Front, German army units felt like they had the upper hand and still believed that they would ultimately prevail. So the abdication of the Kaiser and the subsequent formation of the Weimar Republic, led by the Social Democratic Party, contributed to the perceptions of betrayal on the part of the more nationalist, German populations. And the Spartacist uprising, which was put down by Weimar, by using returning soldiers, really splintered and discredited the German left with many Germans for a long period of time. They felt like the Social Democrats had betrayed Germany proper. And so even while the Social Democratic Party retained the support of many German workers, Germans broadly viewed the Social Democrats as a kind of treason. And there was broad outrage at the punitive nature of the Treaty of Versailles, and in particular the harsh reparations that were imposed on Germany. So at war's end, Hitler remained in the army. He was still serving. He had been reassigned to military intelligence. And one of his assignments was to infiltrate a small right-wing political party, which was at the time known as the German Workers' Party. The army ordered Hitler to join the party, where he heard a lot of anti-Semitic, anti-socialist, anti-capitalist sentiments that largely jived with his belief system. And so by 1920, error on that slide, I need to correct. That's a scary thing. Hitler had risen to a leadership of what had been rebranded the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which was the Nazis for short. He very rapidly built up the membership of the Nazi Party. In this period of time, he was inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922. And in 1923, he thought that he would emulate Mussolini's March on Rome. Hitler had initially begun his recruitment efforts in beer halls throughout Bavaria at the time, in Munich, and was giving vitriolic speeches laced with anti-Semitic and resentment-fueled invective. The beer hall putsch largely centered, again, in the Bavarian city of Munich, which is one of the most populous cities in Germany. Hitler and around 600 Sturmabeltongs, brown shirts, surrounded one of the largest beer halls in Munich, where the Bavarian president at the time was giving a speech. And they basically tried to force this Bavarian political official to support the Nazi call to overthrow the German state and to set up a Nazi-dominated state. The following day, 1,500 Nazis marched on the city's center, where they encountered police, and there was a brief gun battle. In the exchange of fire between Nazis and Munich police, 15 Nazis, 14 police, and one bystander were killed. And Hitler fled. He basically fled into the countryside to avoid arrest, but ultimately was arrested 2 days later. That led to the then 1922, Adolf Hitler was 32 years old. And was tried at the time for high treason. He had a very sympathetic judge. He had very sympathetic lay judges who were kind of assistants to the judge. And following a 4-hour opening statement with a classic kind of, his stock speech of diatribes against Jews and the Bavarian officials who betrayed him, Hitler then moderated his tone and just kind of played nice. And a sympathetic judge allowed him to give long speeches over the course of his trial. He was sentenced to a 5-year confinement with the possibility of parole in 6 months, which was about the minimum that he could have gotten. He could have been, executed, I believe. He was ultimately released for good behavior after only 9 months. And while he was imprisoned, he began writing. At first, he was receiving all these well-wishers and people who wanted to meet the famous Adolf Hitler. He was interviewed several times by newspapers, but ultimately he began saying, to his retinue of people who were also serving with him, Rudolf Hess and some of the others, I need you to keep those folks away from me because I'm going to write my magnum opus. And this would culminate with his publication in 2 volumes of Mein Kampf, which in German Kampf can mean battle, it can mean combat, it can also mean struggle. And most people think, and most often the people who translate Mein Kampf from German into English describe it, basically prefer to use the verb struggle. And so it was written during his imprisonment. It was published in 2 volumes, the first in 1925 and the second released in released in 1926. Interest in the book rose alongside of Hitler's rise in prominence. The minute he got out, he began rebuilding the Nazi Party. He sold roughly 240,000 copies by the time he became chancellor in 1932. He also became fabulously wealthy. He earned over 1 million Deutschmarks as a result of the sales of that book at a time when most German workers were earning around 4,000 Deutschmarks a year. By 1939, which again is 6 years into his time as chancellor and dictator, Mein Kampf had sold over 5.2 million copies in 11 languages. It was something, again, they began giving out free copies to married couples and to, it became part of, Hitler's cult of personality. These days, 1925 first editions of the first volume of Mein Kampf have sold for upwards of $3,000. And it is a collector's item among certain types of people who are attracted to fascist thinking and to the fascist worldview. So let's spend the rest of this presentation talking a little bit about Mein Kampf. And this is about a 13, 14-page excerpt from Mein Kampf, basically a discussion of nation and race. And so he begins this excerpt, which is a portion of the book, talking about his work for Army intelligence. And he was initially assigned to read the newspapers of the Social Democratic Party. And he argued that reading through on a day-to-day basis all the arguments of the Social Democrats led him back to his Volk, led him back to his own people. And looking back at that experience, he says, only an idiot can look upon the work of this mind-poisoning culprit and still blame the victim. In other words, he's basically saying that socialism is a disease. It is a poisoning of the mind, and ultimately you'll find out that he equates socialism with Judaism and sees them as synonymous. And so he's basically saying that all these workers who are social democrats have been deluded. They're delusional. And so he basically would declare the mind of the masses is not open to any doctrines that advocates half measures or is in any way weak or vacillating. And so he is basically saying that social democrats have been using terror and force in the factories and in beer halls and elsewhere to force workers to adhere to this sickness, this ideological poisoning. And so he is advocating the need for equal and equivalent brutality. The metaphor that Hitler deploys to set up this conclusion is the claim that just as a woman whose mental state is not much influenced by abstract reason as by an inexpressible emotional desire for a force which will round out and complete her nature, and who as a result would prefer to prostrate herself before a strong man than to rule over a weakling. So too would the masses basically say, I love a strong leader more than a pleading moderate. The masses feel more satisfied by an intolerant doctrine than they are by granting liberal freedoms. It's kind of similar to something Bill Clinton would say. He said people would rather that a leader be strong and wrong than weak and right. And so he's basically arguing that you have to use terror of a sort. If social democracy were to be opposed by any doctrine of more profound truth, but employing equally brutal methods, the latter will triumph. Social democrats fear a vapid, cowardly genius less than a forceful man of middling intelligence. He's kind of making a kind of self-deprecating reference there. Our solemn duty is to inform all weaklings that the question before us is to be or not to be, a Hamlet kind of moment, right? Will we not, dare to be great? For myself, I acquired a balanced recognition of the significance of physically terrorizing both the individual and the masses. So again, he's basically saying, that you have to be ruthless in confronting the social democrats. And he makes an extended kind of metaphor, talking about nature. And this is important. We'll talk about the idea of nature in later, later discussions. For now, recall the liberal, argument, for somebody like John Locke, which would be that humanity is ordained by God to dominate nature, to take nature, and to convert nature into, community, into civilization. And so for Hitler, he begins talking about the most obvious of nature's principles, and that is the segregation of all species living on Earth. He would state, the titmouse mates with the titmouse. Each and every animal mates exclusively with a member of its own species. He is effectively conflating species with race, okay? Only the strangest and most unusual circumstances can alter this, principle of nature. The cross-breeding of any two creatures which are not exactly the same produces a qualitative average between the levels of the two parents. And again, he's using this metaphor and extending it to humanity based on a racial calculation. This is deeply reflective and largely drawing on the arguments of Arthur de Gobineau, right? The sense in which races are discrete, they impose physiological differences upon humanity, and that these physiological differences can't simply be ignored. So Hitler takes on this ball from Gobineau and runs with it, right? And speaks extensively about racial purity and degeneration. The long experience of history, and again, like Gobineau, he's invoking history, but he's not really providing any evidence. The long experience of history offers numerous proofs of this profound truth. The outcome of all Racial mixing is A, the sure but steady lowering of the physical, of the level of the superior race, and B, the physical and mental deterioration, and thus the start of a slowly but certainly increasing illness within that race. In other words, again, this is a kind of argument that race mixing poisons the blood of the purer race. So in response to the Enlightenment claim that humanity's destiny is to conquer nature, Hitler's reply is humanity's destiny is to follow nature's path. And for Hitler, following nature's path means that the strongest races will conquer and that the races of the weak will submit to the will of the strong. And he's basically saying that human beings have to follow that nature. And ultimately, he speaks for a little while about humanitarian pacifism. And he makes this argument that humanitarianism is legitimate, but only after the highest racial type has already conquered and subjugated the world over which he then rules alone and supreme. It's interesting, he says he rather than the race itself. This is, again, according to the implacable and irrevocable laws of nature. And then he goes on to an extended discussion of how the greatest cultures die out because inevitably they poison their blood with uncreative races. Another quote from Hitler: "The worst fate is reserved for the man who believes he can conquer nature. In acting on that belief, he becomes a pitiful laughingstock." If you look at the slide, this is giving you, basically Hitler's vision for, the 1,000-year Reich, that inevitably it would expand eastward into, Central Europe, through Eastern Asia, all the way to the Caucasus. That would be the place where Hitler's, the Aryan race would enslave all these Slavic peoples and would yoke themselves to, the production of a greater culture. And so this gives rise, again, Gobineau talks a lot about the Aryan race. Hitler waxes rhapsodic, basically declaring the Aryan race the Prometheus of humankind. If you recall, Prometheus is the Greek who gives to humanity the gift of fire and is punished by the gods for that. All that counts as the highest human culture have been created by the Aryan race, according to Adolf Hitler. This singular fact allows us to infer that the Aryan alone was the originator of all that counts as culture and humanity. Hitler's classification of mankind, he's basically riffing off Gobineau a little bit, but he's basically saying what we have are cultural originators in class 1, cultural carriers in class 2, and cultural destroyers in class 3. And the Aryan race alone falls into this first category of culture originators. And so if you read at this point, he starts talking about Japan, which is, at this time, Japan is going through its militarization process and is largely engaged in snapping up pieces of China. I think by it might have been in the early 30s that they took over parts of northern China and renamed it the Kingdom of Manchukuo. But Hitler would ruminate on Japan, contrary to what some people believe, that the Japanese merely added European technology to their culture. European science and technology are decorated with Japanese qualities. But instead, the foundation of their real life is not any longer their unique Japanese culture, although that culture continues to determine the shape and color of life in Japan. And this is because externally, as a result of internal differences, it is more noticeable to European visitors. There's a number of sentence fragments in here that just, if you're an English person, you're reading that and going, how did this get into print? back to Hitler. The enormous scientific and technological achievements of Europe and America have been brought about only by the Aryans. Only because of Aryan intelligence, ingenuity, and invention can the East follow the general progress of humanity. The Aryans supplied the foundation of their competition for daily bread to create weaponry and technological means or technical means for it. And only the outward appearances slowly but surely grafted onto the Japanese character. I mean, it's stunning, the cultural, the ethnocentrism and arrogance that informs that kind of a statement. And so again, he goes back to talking about this, how important it is for races, especially for Aryans, to be kept culturally and racially pure. And so he contends that Aryans have always been the carriers of cultural uplift. So if you look at any, great civilization, according to Adolf Hitler, Aryans were at the bottom of it. Aryans came along and they created all the cool stuff. But the problem according to Hitler, is that Aryans lack the ability to enact all their great cultural ingenuity. They have to have human laborers. And so, absent the opportunity of using the labor of the lower races, Aryans would not have been able to create their own superior culture. So according to Hitler, Aryans are parasitic. They conquer other peoples and then they use them to create these great works of art and literature and everything else. So allowing enslaved people human dignity, according to Hitler, simply creates the opportunity for racial commingling, which for Hitler is the pathway to racial degeneration, which provides Hitler with a convenient rationale for cruelty. This is a direct quote. Everyone who does not belong to the superior race is worthless. With one caveat, I should probably say, though Hitler doesn't say it, they're worthless except as slave labor. And so when you wonder, about the inhumanity of the concentration camps, and the statement above the gates of one of the Arbeit macht frei, labor will make you free. For the Germans, they meant freedom for you to be worked to death. And that rationale is implicit in Hitler's arguments in Mein Kampf. And so, he's basically, again, he's making an argument, and he has to do the whole inversion of Marxism. And so he argues that for Aryans, what makes them great is this sense of idealism, this sense of other regardingness, this sense in which the Aryan outlook subsumes self-interest to the interest of the Volk, again, of the people. And so the power of Pflichterfüllung, which is a German word for fulfilling one's destiny. For Hitler, this means not to be self-interested, but to serve only the interests of the community. And so for Hitler, Aryan idealism means having the purity of spirit, which allows them to be unique in joining the clenched fist to the brilliant intellect. Again, think about what he's talking about. Think about the language. Only idealism motivates men to recognize the right conferred by power. They become tiny particles of dust that nature shapes and serves to its own end. And he would basically extend this and say that it is Der Führer who knows nature and who knows how to direct, the human particles of dust to become the greatness that is, the state, the 1,000-year Reich, if you will. And so what is the only force that threatens the Aryan race and Aryanism? The Jews. And again, for Hitler, and much of the writing in Mein Kampf is just an extended diatribe, and you rarely see a clearer expression of anti-Semitism, which we're going to explore in greater detail in a presentation next week. You rarely see a more purely distilled hatred of any other people than the kind of anti-Semitic invective that Hitler repeatedly gives voice to over the course of his discussion of Jews in Mein Kampf. I had a friend in college that became interested in fascism and actually bought a copy of Mein Kampf and said, I really think that that guy had some interesting ideas. And I had read Mein Kampf as an undergraduate. I'd read some other, I'd read a lot of Friedrich Nietzsche and stuff like that. And I was like, dude, you are headed down a very dark and ugly pathway. If you don't want to sleep well at night, read Mein Kampf. And so Hitler would write of the Jews, no other race has a more highly developed sense of self-preservation than the Jews, who had the temerity to call themselves God's chosen people. He characterizes Jewish intellectual abilities as a kind of fake intellect. He's basically saying that intellect is really a facade, that Aryans are not smart. Aryans are ingenuous, but they're straightforward. Jewish intellect is all about subterfuge. He would contend, because Jews have never had a culture of their own, the basis of their mental development were always built by other people. This reflects the sense of Jews as being a people without a homeland, as a result of the Roman diaspora and the fact that Jews found themselves living in separate, in exile communities throughout Europe, but also in many parts of the Middle East, even into India. There were Jewish communities, and so he looks at that and says, "See, that's what's wrong with them. They have no creative soul of their own. They have to take from others and fuse their soul." And he would say things like, they learn how to look like Europeans or like the host, culture. And they learn to speak the language, but they always think like a Jew, which, again, is this, it is again innately and inevitably ad hominem, everything that he says about Jewish people. He would argue that Judaism is the opposite of Aryan idealism. Among Jews, the willingness to sacrifice themselves does not transcend any individual Jew's raw sense of self-preservation. Well, the Holocaust proves that otherwise on that. But again, you ask yourself, and I'll conclude on this note, why did Hitler hate the Jews with such intense passion? Some would argue that it was because it was possible that one of Hitler's more distant relatives was Jewish, that he may have had some Jewish blood within him. I'm skeptical that was the case. I think that Hitler was a bit of a sociopath. I think that he was probably on the scale, autistic in a way. And I'm not saying that he had any kind of mental problem, but I think he was tunnel visioned in a way. And I think his experience in the German army, especially in the waning days of the war, and if you look at this slide, it shows kind of a cartoon of the stab in the back imagery that was so prevalent among Germans in the post-war period. And again, it's so easy to say it was those Jews that did it. It was the Jews that are the bankers that got into the ear of German statesmen and forced the Kaiser to step down. It was the Jews that insinuated and caused workers to revolt. And and so on. And that sort of language really just, and he, to him, I think it was just, I think he believed it. I think he bought into it. And so we're going to close on that note. We're going to pick up, because I can only take a little bit of Mein Kampf at any given time. We will conclude our discussion of Mein Kampf. We will continue our discussion of German Nazism. And then we'll begin talking about, fascism in other manifestations. And in our last presentation on fascism, we'll begin talking about fascism today. What do we see? And it's important. Ideology, you don't need to leap to conclusions. You simply have to have a clear criterion of what it is. Ideologically speaking, what is it that makes a person a fascist, right? Hypernationalism, racial resentment, a belief in kind of a dictatorship, anti-democratic sentiments. This is the checklist. We'll begin looking at that checklist a little bit more carefully in later presentations and thinking about, again, what it means. If you want to call someone a fascist, you should know what it means. I'll close on that note, and I'll see you next time.